will now come to order. Today's hearing is entitled The Clean Future Act, Industrial Climate Policies to Create Jobs and Support Working Communities, and will examine several provisions of the recently introduced H.R. 1512. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you choose to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Rebecca Tomilchik at the email address we've provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I grew up and continue to live in a mill town, Amsterdam, New York, formerly one of the largest carpet-producing cities in the world. And when I was young, the mills closed. My grandparents were among those workers who, through no fault of their own, lost their jobs. Those mills went to the southern states and then eventually offshore. And the people and community left behind had little to no support for many, many years. I've spent my life, along with other community leaders, working to revitalize our city, to rebuild by building new infrastructure, redevelop waterfront industrial properties, and attract new and innovative businesses. It has taken 60 years, and there is still more work to be done. These types of economic disruptions have happened before. They are happening right now, and they will continue happening whether or not we pass the Clean Future Act. There's always some risk when a community relies on one employer or one industry. We can pretend this is not the case, or we can work together and do better for the people and communities facing this challenge today than was done for my grandparents and my hometown. With a national commitment, as is proposed in the Clean Future Act, we can treat energy workers with respect. We can provide the resources to accelerate local economic redevelopment and diversification. And we can provide fairness for the workers and communities that have powered our country for decades. The bill proposes a framework for a national energy transition strategy. This has been done for other issues of national importance that cut across several federal agencies. For example, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Council on Environmental Quality. And importantly, this approach recognizes that it is not for me or anyone else in Washington to try to dictate these transitions. It must be a community-driven process, since every affected community will have different needs, different wants, and different assets. The Clean Future Act provides federal resources and technical assistance to empower local community leaders to manage their own economic transitions. This hearing will also examine some of the bill's provisions regarding the industrial sector. We know the industrial sector is diverse and does account for a large amount of emissions. Some subsectors are energy intensive, trade exposed, and difficult to decarbonize. Decarbonizing the United States industry requires investing in the United States industry, and investing in our manufacturers is the key to America's long-term global competitiveness. The Clean Future Act includes several provisions to make those investments. This includes the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which provides access to financing to make investments across numerous sectors in support of our nation's clean energy transition. The Clean Future Act also includes an innovative Buy Clean proposal that leverages public procurement to support low emissions industrial products. While over 22% of the U.S. climate emissions are from the industrial sector, a small number of facilities make up a very large share of that total. Many of these products, including cement and steel, are purchased in large quantities by the public sector. In the United States, nearly 1/2 of all cement and 1/5 of steel is purchased with tax dollars. These products are critical to our goals of rebuilding America's infrastructure, and we have the opportunity to support building with cleaner, more innovative materials than ever before. Buy Clean brings transparency to the market. It standardizes how to calculate embodied emissions of products so that the private sector and state and local governments can indeed make informed decisions about what they purchase. It also supports federal leadership by requiring federal use of products with the proposed Climate Star label, a voluntary label similar to the popular Energy Star and WaterSense programs. Buy Clean leverages things that are already occurring in the private sector through environmental product declarations, while seeking to improve data quality, guard against unfair foreign competition, and reward investments in U.S. manufacturing. The Clean Future Act's industrial sections are critical to the growth and the retention of U.S. manufacturing jobs and the promotion of markets for new and innovative products. And the worker and community title is critical to fulfilling our commitment that no one is left behind during this energy transition. I believe these are areas where we should be able to find bipartisan support. I'm looking forward to today's testimony and hope we can work together to improve these sections of the committee's proposal. With that, I now yield to the the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environmental and Climate Change, our ranking member, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Representative McKinley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are here to examine the Clean Future Act, but it reminds me, during the Vietnam War, an American general was paraphrased as saying, we had to destroy the town to save it. We had to destroy the town to save it. It reminds me of the motivation behind this proposal. The goal of the act is to decarbonize the U.S. economy by 2050, have net zero emissions from power plants by 2035, 80% by 2030. In so doing, well, we're going to destroy livelihoods, disrupt families, decimate communities, increase utility bills, threaten the stability of our grid, and we will still experience negative effects of climate change since the rest of the world isn't following suit. Look, Chairman, we agree we need to work to reduce carbon emissions, but we also need to understand the consequences before we rush into such a punitive action. Let's keep in mind, last year, 60% of our power came from fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. It's reasonable to understand that this total transformation, is it reasonable to undertake this total transformation of our electric grid in less than 14 years or even 9? Look at solar energy. They're predicting that in their publication this week, they're predicting they're going to quadruple their capacity in solar in the next 10 years. Now, make sure we understand. That means they're going from 2.3% of the mix to 9%. But remember, coal and gas are still 60%. According to the utilities we've consulted, decarbonizing our power sector by 2035 and 80% by 2030 will take a miracle. So, Paul, at what cost? It will increase costs for families with higher utility bills. According to the Institute for Energy Research, $2,000 per household annually. It'll destroy jobs, not just coal miners and pipeliners, but all the secondary jobs that rely on them. The railroad workers, the barge operators, the machinists, the fabricators, I can go on and on. Where will these workers go? Many of them are making $70,000, $80,000, $100,000. We get these vague promises about making solar panels or windmills. About these promises, Terry Sullivan, the president of the International Labor Union, said, it's pie in the sky BS. And he didn't say BS about this green jobs being good middle class jobs. He said, because they're not. As a result, single industry towns like Welch, West Virginia, Gillette, Wyoming, Hazard, Kentucky, Cadiz, Ohio, they're going to be crushed. Not to mention, we will be left with a grid that is far less reliable and resilient, with more frequent blackouts. Haven't we learned anything from California and Texas about how fragile our grid is? And for what gain? Even if America totally decarbonizes, the rest of the world is still increasing its consumption of fossil fuels. We still have wildfires on the West Coast, droughts and flooding in the Midwest, and hurricanes on the East. Mr. Chairman, we want to work in a bipartisan fashion to address climate change and utilize all of the above energy resources. This committee has demonstrated a history of bipartisanship, and if you'll let us, we can do it again. Let's not destroy the village in order to save it. So we have on our panel, we have Kevin Sunday from the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, who's going to be testifying today. He will explain Pennsylvania's dependence on fossil fuel resources for economic growth and job creation, and discuss the devastation, the impact this legislation will have on his state. I look forward to this conversation today, and I hope that we can work with Frank Pallone and all of you on this committee, how we can make this a bipartisan bill, or start with something that is bipartisan from the very beginning. So I thank you, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the very busy chair of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I like the characterization of busy. Thank you. Today we're holding our first legislative hearing on HR 1512, the Clean Future Act, which is our comprehensive and ambitious legislation to combat the climate crisis and achieve 100% clean economy by no later than 2050. And I just want to say to my friend, Mr. McKinley, the ranking member, look, we obviously want to do things on a bipartisan basis. I'll keep repeating that over and over again. But I also want to stress, this is the Innovation Committee. This is the innovation country. And we can't be left behind. I guess, I know that climate change is viewed obviously as an environmental issue, a health issue, but it's also a security issue. And, I constantly say to Ms. Rogers that, I agree with her that China is the enemy, that China is the competition. But I am just so afraid that if we don't innovate, if we don't think about the future, if we don't think what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years, that China's going to eat our lunch and they're going to take our jobs and they're going to, and we're just going to be left behind in this global competition. So, when you say, my colleague from West Virginia, that, that we have to look at this long term, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at this long term and be innovative and creative in what we do, because we don't want to be left behind. But anyway, I just wanted to say that this Clean Future Act is the product of nearly 30 hearings and countless ideas and recommendations from members. At the heart of our bill is a commitment to achieving net zero greenhouse gas pollution no later than 2050, with an interim goal of reducing pollution by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. And science is the impetus for our goal. Innovation is the impetus. The climate crisis presents one of our greatest challenges, but it also presents one of our greatest opportunities. And I want to stress the opportunities through innovation. Today's hearing will examine clean future provisions that seize the opportunity to use climate action to create jobs and support working communities. First, we have the federal Buy Clean program, which would steadily reduce emissions from construction materials and products used in federally funded projects. This innovative program leverages government funding and procurement power to fundamentally transform and strengthen the competitiveness of the U.S. manufacturing sector. And next, and first of its kind, we have the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which would help states, communities, and companies transition to a clean economy. Capitalized with $100 billion, the Accelerator will mobilize public and private investment. Finally, the Worker and Community Transition title ensures every worker and community has federal level support and resources during the nation's transition to a clean economy. The legislation creates a new Office of Energy and Economic Transition in the Executive Office of the President, and this office develops programs to support dislocated workers and provide financial assistance to local governments. This assistance, coupled with the bill's infrastructure investments, will support economic development. Now, collectively, these three provisions provide new opportunities to decarbonize the industrial sector, but also bolster our economy. And I also wanted to mention before I close that there are pathways to industrial decarbonization that already exist. We have many technologies and programs available now that, with meaningful funding and wider deployment, would drive industrial sector improvements. Just today, EPA announced that 95 manufacturing plants earned Energy Star certification in 2020 for being amongst the most energy efficient plants in industries like automotive, baking, cement. And I know that the Republicans believe in efficiency, believe in resiliency. You talk to me about it all the time. Energy efficiency is crucial as part of a decarbonization strategy. And this Energy Star industrial program will help us reach our clean economy goals. So I guess what I really want to stress is I believe that these and other climate policies in the Clean Future Act will empower America's workers with new good paying jobs and ensure that we do not fall behind in global competition. They will revitalize our communities with the support they need to rebuild from the pandemic and leave no one behind. So I just think that, you know, we're working on protecting the environment, protecting our health, but at the same time through innovation, we can get there and create more jobs and be competitive and not be left behind. And so I understand what you're saying, Mr. McKinley. I don't disagree with a lot of the things you say, but let's think of ways that we can do this together, which is, I think, our common goal. Thank you, Chairman Tonko.
Chair yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Rogers, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement. Representative Rogers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Tonko and Chairman Pallone. I appreciated what you had to say there. We have shared goals around protecting our health, protecting our environment, leading the world in innovation. Our concern is, first of all, America is leading. America is leading in bringing down carbon emissions today. We're doing that through American innovation, American technology. We're doing it through carbon capture, advanced nuclear. We're leading the world in advanced nuclear technology that is absolutely fundamental to the goals around bringing down carbon emissions. Our concern is that the agenda, as we hear, being promoted right now by many Democrats, is one that's focused on solar and wind and batteries that are controlled by China. And so I am very concerned that there's a lack of recognition that 90% of the solar panels, 80% of the wind machines, 90% of the rare earth minerals, the batteries are in Asia or in China. And so a future, a clean energy future that is based upon those kind of solutions that are dominated by China is really a pro-China agenda. It's making us vulnerable. Have we not learned anything through COVID and the concern around supply chains as to the vulnerability and the dependence that we have on China for basic fundamental needs? So that is, I think that summarizes why there's a fundamental concern with the direction that is being laid out right now. The Republicans on this committee, we are ready, and we are ready to work with you to address the climate risk. We must pursue policies that will not undermine our communities or our national security. It means protecting energy affordability and reliability and building a stronger economy. We should also work together to help the nation confront all future risk. We should preserve what is best for our nation, our communities, our families, and the freedom and dignity of workers. This is the path to securing a cleaner energy future. You can achieve a clean future by relying upon free enterprise and private initiative. This will unleash innovation and transform how we make and do things with massive benefits for our society. It's how America has led the world in lifting people out of poverty and empowering people to build better lives. America will win the future by building on our assets and our strengths. That includes our abundant resources, which helps us preserve and strengthen our strategic relationships to confront the national security challenges. This is the practical path that Republicans support in our legislative work to update permitting and reduce regulations in order to deploy new, cleaner technologies more quickly and at a lower cost. This path rejects one-size-fits-all central planning, as experience tells us, is suitable only for special interest and federal regulators. So today we're talking about the Clean Future Act. It's a 1,000-page bill, and it seeks to transform the nation's economy, its energy systems, the way people live. on a time frame and at a scale that far surpasses anything practical. For example, energy technology expert Mark Mills testified before this panel last month on the scale of this transformation, if it were possible just for the power sector. He said this about meeting the goals of 2035, quote, "It would require a continuous construction program at least 600% bigger than any single peak year for utility construction that has occurred in the US, China, or Germany over the past half century," end quote. Given technological and market realities, this build out would increase American reliance on China and do little to reduce global emissions or improve America's competitive edge. This is not the policy outcome we want. But we will be on this path if we rush down the top-down regulatory controls over our power, transportation, and industrial sectors. The problem is, at this pace, it's a rush, and it makes no allowance for technological readiness. Carbon capture for natural gas or industrial processes are tough. It's very tough, and it's chilling. It's a chilling impact for energy workers today in America. Let's reject the central planning. Let's free our innovators by reducing regulations. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written statements, opening statements, shall be made part of the record. I now will introduce the witnesses that we have for today's hearing. First, Dr. Rebecca Dell, PhD, Director of the Industry Program at Climate Works Foundation. Mr. Bob Pershepi, President, Center of Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES, on behalf of the Renewable Thermal Collaborative. Mr. Kevin Sunday, Director of Government Affairs, Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. And finally, Mr. Jason Walsh, Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance. At this time, I recognize Dr. Dell for 5 minutes to provide an opening statement. And again, welcome, Dr. Dell.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you to the entire subcommittee for the invitation to testify on the Clean Future Act. Today, I will address the importance of Buy Clean for rebuilding our infrastructure, investing in American manufacturing, and addressing the climate crisis. As you all know, this bill establishes a Buy Clean program to steadily reduce greenhouse gas emissions from federal construction. I will explain what Buy Clean is and why it's important for addressing bipartisan concerns like infrastructure and national competitiveness. I'll mention some complementary actions that Congress can take to accelerate progress in American manufacturing. We all know that we need a major national infrastructure investment. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave our infrastructure an overall grade of C-. Climate change will only accelerate this need. So why should we support Buy Clean? First, Buy Clean is important because it targets the most important sectors. As Chairman Pallone reminded us, this bill sets a national target of 50% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We simply cannot achieve these goals without dramatically reducing industrial emissions, which account for a quarter or more of national emissions. These emissions are heavily concentrated in a small number of industries, especially making building materials like steel and cement. The government is the largest consumer of building materials, buying nearly half of cement and a fifth of steel. Buy Clean policies require or incentivize the government to buy building materials made with cleaner processes. The environmental stakes are not small. Without Buy Clean, the infrastructure bill passed through the House last year could lead to an additional 200 million tons of CO2 emissions from making the associated building materials. As you consider a major infrastructure reinvestment as part of the economic recovery from COVID-19, it's more urgent than ever that we modernize our infrastructure in a way that does not contribute to the climate crisis. Second, Buy Clean is powerful because it uses government leverage to increase innovation and competitiveness in manufacturing. Countries and companies around the globe have realized that climate-safe manufacturing and construction practices are essential for their long-term competitiveness. We are significantly behind many other large economies in Europe and Asia in this respect. Buy Clean offers companies that want to invest in clean manufacturing the opportunity to profit by it. It's not a burden on American manufacturing, but an investment in high-quality jobs. It prevents foreign producers from getting around the rules, and domestic producers would have the same advantages they always have had, like Buy America requirements. The best part is that Buy Clean is affordable. Cement is responsible for the largest share of emissions in public construction, but it only accounts for about 1% of the cost of projects. Because it's such a small portion of the total cost, even if clean cement is more expensive than conventional cement in the near term, it won't significantly change the overall cost of infrastructure. Finally, in order for Buy Clean to be successful, it needs leadership and innovation investment. Buy Clean policies should be complemented by dramatically increased investments in industrial innovation and commercialization of critical industrial technologies. This is long overdue. Manufacturing and construction generate more employment and almost as much GDP as the healthcare industry. Yet healthcare is supported by the innovation activities of NIH with an annual budget of $42 billion, or 5,000% of what the government spends on industrial innovation. Congress should fund programs to commercialize critical new industrial technologies at a much larger scale than currently. To succeed, this entire agenda needs high-level leadership. Currently, the highest-ranking person in the federal government, whose job it is to advance the future of American manufacturing, has the rank of acting office director. In order for both innovation investments and Buy Clean programs to be successful, Congress should create an additional Assistant Secretary of Energy for Manufacturing and Industry, as recommended in this bill. In conclusion, Buy Clean supports American innovation and competitiveness. It reduces greenhouse gases and local pollution, and it does not significantly increase costs. We should use Buy Clean, supported by expanded and elevated investments in industrial innovation, to affordably address the climate crisis and increase the competitiveness of American manufacturing. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dell. And now we'll move to Mr. Perciasepi. You are recognized, sir, for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member McKinley. Thank you all for inviting me today. I'm here to testify, as you mentioned, on behalf of the Renewable Thermal Collaborative. I am the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and before joining the center 7 years ago, I was the deputy administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. The Renewable Thermal Collaborative is a global coalition of companies and institutions committed to scaling up renewable heating and cooling at their facilities, thus reducing carbon emissions. The collaborative was founded in 2017, and it is facilitated by C2ES, the David Gardner and Associates, and the World Wildlife Fund. The industrial sector is very challenging to decarbonize due to its very tremendous amount of diversity and its reliance on a large quantity of energy and heat. And the fundamental nature of many of the core manufacturing processes also produce greenhouse gases. Industrial emissions account for about 29% of the emissions in the United States, and they're projected to grow over the next decade under our current situations and become potentially by 2030 the largest source of emissions in the United States. The goals of the Thermal Collaborative are to create a community of corporate buyers of technology, of service, to establish policy support, and to put us on a path so that the industrial sector can reduce its thermal emissions by 30% by 2030, with a goal of full sector decarbonization by the middle of the century in 2050. Policy and the use of policy has been an underutilized resource for achieving decarbonization in the industrial sector. And the Thermal Collaborative recently published a report which surveyed leading policies across the world, in Europe and in the United States, on advancing low carbon technologies. We explored a number of policy approaches to catalyze a wide variety of renewable thermal technologies, including geothermal, beneficial electrification, green hydrogen, solar thermal technologies, renewable natural gas, biomass, and biogas, and others. Advancing the low carbon solutions, the level of policies at the state level are often targeted to specific technologies or specific companies or specific corporate and business sectors, and they tend to be fragmented. At the federal level, if you use it as an example of what has been done in the power sector, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit has spurred billions of dollars of investment and reduced the cost of renewable energy in the power sector. We identified a number of policies that could really help in the industrial sector: expanded research, development, demonstration and deployment, grant programs, and a national financial facility that could provide grants as well as crucial financing, deployment initiatives, procurement, as you just heard from Dr. Dell, and renewable thermal portfolio standards that could help. The Clean Future Act is on track on a number of these points, and I'll mention three things in particular. The Clean Energy Manufacturing Grant Program would support a range of zero and low emitting technologies, including some of the technologies mentioned in the opening comments already today. There's a special attention to the carbon and energy intensive industries. Carbon Mitigation Fund would support beneficial electrification and could be benefited by expanding the eligibility to other low carbon renewable thermal technologies that meet a robust sustainability criteria. And the third one I'll mention is the Clean Energy Sustainability Accelerator. In many ways, I look at this as the accelerator of innovation. You have lots of innovation taking place already, as many have already mentioned, but what we have here is a financial facility that will help accelerate the deployment of those innovations as they occur, getting to that next step of implementation and deployment, which is very, very important. And it has a wide variety of flexibilities to enable it to accomplish those goals. Let me just say, in conclusion here, that fragmented policies that apply only to certain locations or certain technologies or certain kinds of business classes will result in uneven approaches. A federally based financial incentives, such as are envisioned in the Clean Futures Act, will really help accelerate the innovation that we need in the industrial sector. And I'll stop at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Perciasepe, for your input. And now we'll move to Mr. Sunday. And again, welcome, Mr. Sunday. Good to have you joining us, and you are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. And good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member McKinley, and members of the committee. Thank you for the honor and privilege to appear before you today to represent the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. We're the largest business advocacy organization in the state of Pennsylvania, which itself is the #2 state for natural gas development, energy production, and nuclear power. We're the biggest power producer on the 13-state PJM grid, and we're also a leader in a number of manufacturing segments. My testimony talks about how Pennsylvania's energy and industrial base have helped put this country in the catbird seat for sustainable economic growth. And I reemphasize that our workers and companies are up to the task in meeting the many challenges of the 21st century. Let me make a few summary points of my testimony. First, the development of Marcellus Shale has led to massive investment into new pipeline energy and manufacturing infrastructure, and projects like the Shell petrochemical facility in Southwest Pennsylvania are totally changing the course of a region that was left behind a generation ago. We're seeing natural gas and renewable resources being paired together to develop resilient microgrid projects at critical infrastructures like airports and the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. Combined heat and power projects are helping universities, hospital systems, and manufacturers in pulp and paper and food product segments manage costs and improve sustainability. And manufacturers in Pennsylvania are underway with projects to use carbon capture and natural gas liquids to sustainably produce ammonia, hydrogen, and fertilizer. And at the same time, air quality in our state's improving dramatically. We're in statewide attainment or very close to it for all national ambient air quality standards. Since 2005, no state has reduced CO2 emissions more than Pennsylvania but one. And as EPA officials recently noted, the nationwide 2030 goals of the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan have already been achieved due to market forces. In part because of Pennsylvania's resource base to help this country reduce emissions and send power prices in our regional grid down to generational lows, no country has the story to tell like that of the United States when it comes to reducing costs and emissions while growing the economy. The United States has lapped the European Union in growth over the past decade and a half while reducing emissions more, and our energy prices are much lower. And so while it's reasonable to discuss setting long-term goals, we have real challenges today, and we need smart policy that will unlock further investment in environmental gains. A more predictable, rational, and flexible air quality permit process, including reforms to new source review, will allow for more investment in domestic facilities, including carbon capture, and a stronger domestic manufacturing base, instead of production in other countries who don't share our country's commitment to stewardship. In addition, whether it's a bridge or a port or an energy infrastructure component, it takes entirely long to build any new infrastructure in this country if that project's touched by the National Environmental Policy Act. And it's imperative we streamline the federal decision-making process if America is going to have the infrastructure to compete. The pandemic and recent energy crisis in multiple states have shown the need for smart, durable, bipartisan policy that accommodates resilient energy resources and that allows manufacturers to quickly retool. It's vital we leverage our human capital and knowledge bases in a host of traditional industries to meet the challenges of tomorrow, especially given the economic data showing the only rural regions of the country that are keeping up in terms of productivity and wage growth are those with natural resource economies. And moreover, energy security in the coming decades will require policy that accommodates expanded mining for critical minerals, efficient build-out of energy and telecommunications infrastructure, and continued investment into exploration and production of hydrocarbons and nuclear power. Finally, given our nation's environmental requirements are much more stringent than other countries, it's imperative that regulatory policy doesn't end up offshoring key industries like refining, steel, cement, concrete, aggregates, and timber, all resources that we're going to need regardless of what the energy mix looks like. In closing, because our state's success has helped the United States keep energy costs lower than nearly every other developed nation while outpacing them in growth, I hope you consider our contributions and assets as you work towards producing durable, bipartisan, effective policy that keeps the United States in a flagship position in this increasingly challenging and dynamic global marketplace. Again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sunday, for your contribution to today's hearing. And finally, we'll move to Mr. Walsh. Mr. Walsh, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member McKinley, distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Jason Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance. On behalf of my organization, our labor and environmental partners, and the millions of members and supporters they represent, I want to thank you for convening this hearing today regarding the Clean Future Act and how it can help us rebuild our economy while creating good jobs, reducing pollution, and revitalizing communities. Congress has taken historic action to address the COVID-driven health and economic crisis, yet significant challenges facing our nation remain. We went into this pandemic with 3 ongoing and interconnected crises: income inequality, racial injustice, and climate change, each of which exacerbates the other. Legislation should tackle these crises at the same time with intersecting solutions, and the Clean Future Act is one such piece of legislation. The act will help revitalize American manufacturing, support workers and communities impacted by our nation's energy transition, and invest in clean infrastructure to create good, accessible union jobs. First, the Clean Future Act includes an important focus on the industrial sector. As an integral part of a strategy to address the climate emergency head-on, we have the opportunity to modernize and transform our industrial base to make it the cleanest and most competitive in the world. creating a new generation of good union manufacturing jobs, making clean technology, and making all products in cleaner ways. The Clean Future Act includes a number of key provisions aimed at this, outlined in my written testimony. What I'll flag today is the Buy Clean provisions in the bill, which ensure that federal procurement supports cleaner domestic manufacturing of the materials that go into our public infrastructure projects. I want to note in particular the Act's establishment of an interagency transparency and disclosure program to enhance the quality and availability of data used to calculate emissions of eligible materials and strengthen our understanding of the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers across industries. We believe this is an important and necessary first step, and coupled with robust reinvestment in domestic manufacturing, can help ensure that the United States leads the world in manufacturing the technologies and products of the future in an increasingly carbon-constrained global economy. The Clean Future Act is a great first step, but we urge additional enhanced loan and grant funding for wide-scale deployment of emissions-reducing processes across energy-intensive manufacturing subsectors in America, as well as to fill critical supply chain gaps in clean technology and material supply chains. These policies will help upgrade and modernize the U.S. industrial base and drive a new generation of industrial development that rebuilds good American jobs and is clean, safe, and equitable for workers and communities alike. As we work to rebuild our economy while tackling the underlying crises of climate change and economic and racial inequality, we must prioritize equitable rebuilding and investments in those workers and communities most in need, including those impacted by changes in our nation's energy economy. America's energy transition is well underway, but a transition that is fair for workers and communities isn't something that will happen organically. We need a broad, holistic, government-wide response. This response must keep workers and communities whole, revitalize and diversify local economies, and address inequities while ensuring the retention and creation of good-paying jobs. And we should be clear that the best approach to energy transition among workers and communities in sectors not already impacted is one that prevents economic disruption and employment loss before it happens. BGA strongly supports several structural reforms established in the Clean Future Act to realize these goals. We believe these reforms must go hand in hand with additional policies outlined in my written testimony, such as the establishment of an interagency grant program, a broad system of support for workers, the reclamation of damaged lands and waters, and bankruptcy reform. Lastly, the Clean Future Act includes a number of provisions aimed at ensuring that critical infrastructure investments made across the bill will boost our economy and create jobs while simultaneously reducing pollution, combating climate change, and strengthening our communities. Thanks to key cross-cutting Buy America, prevailing wage, project labor agreement, and community benefit provisions in the bill, these investments will deliver quality, family-sustaining jobs and accessible pathways into those jobs for all Americans. In closing, we want to thank the committee for beginning this conversation and look forward to providing additional feedback and working with you as we move forward on this bill and your broader agenda for the 117th Congress. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Most welcome, and thank you, Mr. Walsh, and thank you to all of our witnesses for the input that is tremendously valuable to the discussion of this phase of activity in the Clean Future Act. So with that, we'll now move to member questions. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Addressing the needs of people and communities that may be disrupted by the energy transition, which is already underway, isn't going to be easy. We should be honest about that, but our current course of action is to do very little in an uncoordinated manner. We need a range of policies and investments, including economic development, workforce development, environmental remediation, and public benefits to ensure fairness for workers and communities in transition. So, Mr. Walsh, let's go to you. How can we most effectively deploy this mix of tools in a coordinated way so that policies are implemented as efficiently as possible? And can we leverage existing state and federal programs?
Thank you, Congressman. There are several provisions providing support for workers and communities in Title X, which I think are foundational and necessary to achieve the kind of fair and equitable transition that you're talking about and make it one of sufficient scale and ambition. So This includes the establishment of an Office of Energy and Economic Transition, the Executive Office of the President, to coordinate and align activities across the resources of the federal government. You mentioned previous precedents and examples like the Office of National Drug Control Policy that we have placed within the EOP. We're going to need that kind of leadership and coordination at the White House level to really drive this transition in a fair and equitable way. There are other provisions like an interagency task force and stakeholder advisory committee to enhance coordination of relevant programs. There is a program to provide financial assistance to local governments that have lost significant amounts of revenue due to permanent facility enclosures and assist local governments. And there's also a program within Title X to fund a one-stop community-based organizations that can help local communities access federal funds and other kinds of funds and provide technical assistance to those communities as they grapple with some of these challenges. So I think Title X is a really good first start.
Thank you. And having a skilled workforce is a community asset. Having good infrastructure is a community asset. Mr. Walsh, as Congress thinks about infrastructure or economic recovery packages, how can these things be leveraged or improved upon to put potentially affected communities in a better position to deal with local economic disruption?
Well, let's talk about infrastructure. I mean, I think there are a number of infrastructure investments that are badly needed in energy transition communities. Let's start with coal communities, right? Where investments in water infrastructure, in broadband, in the reclamation of abandoned mine lands and waters are all crucial, not just for community health, but are also prerequisites for economic development and economic diversification opportunities. We're also going to need a fuller package of supports for workers who are making the transition. I realize that is outside the jurisdiction of this committee, but there are a number of ideas that we have and would be happy to talk with members of the committee about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Dell, your Build Clean report makes it clean that we need an holistic approach with several types of industrial policies to achieve our goals for the sector. And we've tried to cover at least some of those ideas in the Clean Future Act. But today, United States policy to support manufacturing pales in comparison to our foreign competitors like Germany and like China. Do you have advice on how we should elevate these policies as part of both a national economic strategy and the climate strategy?
Thank you, Chairman Tonko, that's a really important question. For a long time, our manufacturing policy in the United States has been quite fragmented and often pushed down to relatively junior levels of the federal bureaucracy, which makes it very difficult for us to have coherent policy that ties together all of the important issues that have already come up, including workforce development, infrastructure, creation of markets for key new opportunity areas, investments in innovation, all of these. And so what we need is greater focus and attention and higher level leadership across multiple parts of the federal government. The Department of Energy is a very important part on the innovation side, but a holistic approach would also require the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Commerce, the Department of the Treasury, and many other parts of the government, which would have to be coordinated at the level of the White House.
Thank you very much. And I certainly think it's important that these policies are built on a transparent, standardized, and high quality data bit of foundation. So thank you so much for your input. I've exhausted my 5 minutes, and so now I will recognize Representative McKinley, Subcommittee Ranking Member, for 5 minutes, sir, to ask questions. Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Chairman. And I just want to remind the committee that Kevin Sunday's wife is about to deliver a baby, his second son. So we all have to appreciate the attention that we are getting his attention on this very important day. But let me direct some questions to you to see how alert you are, Kevin. So the first is, are you aware that the International Energy Agency and others have stated that it's virtually impossible to reach net zero carbon emissions without carbon capture.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so to capture carbon, won't power plants and industrial facilities need a new source review permit to add this equipment?
It's fact specific if NSR would apply, but they're going to at least need to go through the lengthy determination process.
Thank you. And since NSR is a complex and convoluted process, EPA, for example, EPA has issued more than 690 guidelines and policy documents on it over the recent years. Would you agree that this process discourages implementing carbon capture and other clean energy technologies?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, so in your testimony, you said therefore, we need to reform NSR. My question is there NSR reform in this package?
Not based on my reading of the bill, no.
Thank you. So why should we expect anyone across this country is going to do carbon capture? So when you factor in, it takes 2 to 3 years to get a permit, an NSR permit that costs millions of dollars to achieve, and that assumes 2 or 3 years without litigation, and then add the 5 to 6 years for the engineering design, the permitting by the states, and the installation of this equipment. We're talking about it's conceivable that a utility company or manufacturer could take 7 to 10 years to install carbon capture. So I'm back to you, Sunday. Is it reasonable then to assume that we can expect an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030?
No, sir. I believe that'd be a very tall order without further reforms.
And what about 100% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2035 in power plants?
No, same thing.
Okay, so let me change direction just a little bit on this and go to plastics because that's part of it under Section 902. During the pandemic, do you recall the shortage of plastic masks, gloves, shields, and gowns under PPE?
Yes, yes.
And America it was painful and life-threatening for our healthcare workers to not have access to PPE. So if the current manufacturers were unable to meet the demand last year and the year before, wouldn't it make more sense to make more facilities, have more facilities to produce more masks, gowns, shields, and gowns?
Yes, we should have a streamlined permit process to accommodate that type of dynamic market.
So I think it's fundamental here. Now, so you turn to Section 902 of this bill, it withholds permits, new permits for facilities that would produce plastics or the raw materials to use to produce plastics. Could this section therefore prevent the opening of the new petrochemical complex north of Pittsburgh in Monaca, Pennsylvania, or the one being planned in eastern Ohio?
Yes, I believe that language would jeopardize future investment into those types of facilities.
So seriously, we just experienced a shortage of PPE, and this bill calls for more restrictions on the plastics industry? Mr. Sunday, am I missing something?
No, sir. And beyond PPE, we use plastics in automotive devices, weatherizing homes, recreational products like canoes and backpacks. We actually use some petrochemicals in not just storing and transporting the vaccine, but the component itself to capture the messenger RNA so it can cross the bloodstream. These are vital life-sustaining products and medical devices that we rely on, as you mentioned. Just to be clear, my wife is not going into labor like at this moment. We're a couple of days away from that, so I'm not being negligent by any means, but I appreciate the well wishes there and the opportunity to speak before you this morning.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Sunday. I gotta say, it's just bizarre that in a bill of this importance, that there's something in there under Section 902. I just hope we look at that very seriously, the impact it could have on us, and I yield back my time.
Yeah, gentleman yields back, and Mr. Sunday, to you and your wife, all the best on the pending new arrival. The chair now recognizes Representative Pallone, full committee chair. Chairman Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I wanted to talk about decarbonizing the industrial sector. In the Clean Future Act, we have provisions that will help drive down emissions in the industrial sector, but at the same time rebuilding the country's infrastructure and economy. So let me start with Ms. Dell. How can we most effectively use a federal Buy Clean program, which we have in the Clean Future Act, to ensure new infrastructure is developed in a climate-friendly manner? And why is that crucial that we do that?
Thank you so much for the question. I think that the most important reasons why we should invest in a federal Buy Clean program are, one, that the federal government has enormous leverage over emissions, over greenhouse gas emissions. So this is how we actually reduce emissions. And second, this allows us to make a major investment in critical manufacturing sectors. The members of the committee may or may not be aware that in the last 6 months, all 5 of the largest steel companies in the world have committed to bring their emissions to net zero by 2050. These are companies in China, Japan, South Korea, and Europe. No American steel company has made that commitment. So around the world, companies in these critical industries are realizing that their future competitiveness, their long-term success, is tied to their ability to manufacture in a climate-safe way. And I'm very concerned that this is a fast train leaving the station and American firms are waiting on the platform. And so what Buy Clean will do is provide market conditions that allow companies to make a profit by investing in their long-term competitiveness with clean manufacturing, and make a profit by investing in the good jobs that come with that.
Thank you. I want to ask Mr. Walsh the same question. How can we most effectively use the federal Buy Clean program to ensure new infrastructure is developed in a climate-friendly manner? But if you could just answer in a minute, because I have a question for Mr. Pershasepi too that I'd like to get to. Mr. Walsh?
Yeah, I mean, I will echo Rebecca's statements. It's incredibly important that we create markets, right, for producing some of these products in lesser emission ways. We work closely with a number of industry leaders in the iron and steel industries and the cement industries. And the only thing really standing in their way is clear demand signals that the federal government can be a market leader in producing. I do think the emphasis in Title V on other forms of investment in clean technology manufacturing are also really important. I think we're particularly interested and excited by the Clean Energy Manufacturing Grant Program, which also invests in the kind of supply chains that we're going to need as we make this transformation.
Well, thank you. So we also need additional policies and incentives to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial sector. And to that end, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative recently released a suite of policy recommendations for Congress to consider. So, Mr. Pershasepi, can I ask you, how can we use existing laws and policies to quickly curb greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial sector? And hi, how are you doing, by the way?
Hello. Great to see all of you, really. There are plenty of existing policies in the federal government that are designed to provide technical assistance to or advice to many different manufacturers. The Advanced Manufacturing Program at the Department of Energy, and even some of the technical assistance programs at EPA. But what the Clean Futures Act does is harnesses some of that and expands on that. And I think that's a really important part, Mr. Chairman, for us to accelerate those activities that the federal government is able to do. We have a fragmented system, and I think Dr. Dell mentioned that you don't have a cohesive component in the federal government looking at this. So there's an ability for the federal government to coordinate that even without legislation, and they should do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairman Tonko.
You're welcome. The gentleman, the chair yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Rogers full committee ranking member for 5 minutes to ask questions. Representative Rogers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. The Republican policies to address climate change and the risks that face us are driven by an appreciation for the beneficial creations of free enterprise, capitalism, private initiative versus the stifling role of federal regulatory control and central planning. Innovation doesn't come from the federal government. It comes from the ideas in the garages and in the kitchens of people all over this country. And businesses and innovators should build and deploy clean technologies that take advantage of the abundant, affordable energy that we enjoy today as Americans. It is a competitive advantage that I'm concerned will be lost through legislation like is before this committee today. It's also so important to our national security, which is why we seek the regulatory and the permitting reforms in the package that we've put together. You know, when I was elected to Congress, it was interesting. The U.S. was very concerned about the rising cost of natural gas. We were focused on building more import facilities in order to meet the energy needs in our country. And then soon after that, 11 years ago now, in 2009, Waxman-Markey cap and trade passed the House. And at that time, nobody accounted for the American shale revolution. Private companies have taken the technological ideas from the labs and tested them and improved them on their own dime and really took the federal planners by surprise, creating tremendous new economic and security benefits while reducing emissions. Mr. Sunday, you've seen the benefits of this energy renaissance. Given today's industrial focus, would you talk about what you see as the biggest threats of proposals like the Clean Future Act on industrial progress and the benefits in your region?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think one of the biggest threats is we don't take into account the reliability and cost impacts of a sudden and abrupt transition. We know the labor unions estimate the goals of this magnitude would cost about 1.5 million jobs over the next decade and a half. The high energy prices would simply result in offshoring of key industries. And as I've noted in my testimony, higher energy prices don't necessarily translate to better environmental outcomes, but they do translate to worse economic performance for our state and country.
Thank you. As a follow-up, I've seen in Eastern Washington, where I represent, and across the country, the positive work to implement technological advances in communities by major companies like Land O'Lakes American Connection Project. And these companies aren't waiting for the government to take action. They know that they can do it better and faster than the federal government. What work do energy companies in Pennsylvania do to be good stewards of their communities?
Thank you. In addition, as I mentioned, to keeping energy prices low and reducing emissions to put the United States in a world leadership position, it can touch on a number of community initiatives, whether that's constructing turkey habitat in conjunction with the National Wild Turkey Federation, or working with local trade schools to stand up curriculum and through EITC programs donate the type of high-tech equipment that kids that maybe college isn't, not everyone needs to go to college, but they do need a good education. And so going in heavy into skilled trades programs is a focus of a lot of our members, so they can draw on the local high schoolers and put them to work in a family sustaining job that supports American energy independence.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh, I just wanted to turn to the topic of buy clean, which is a major provision in this legislation. From your testimony, it appears that the buy clean legislative provisions are based upon a program that's been mandated in California. And the California program has not been fully implemented. For example, this is the first year that contractors have had to show compliance. We often have concerns about the aggressive and unworkable policies of California that we see resulting in blackouts and increasing energy costs for families and communities. We don't even know how this program is working in California. I just wanted to ask if you could supply for the record evaluations from stakeholders regarding the competitive impacts of this program.
I only have a few seconds left. Happy to do that, Congresswoman. You're right. They're just moving into full implementation this year. But the whole idea of Buy Clean is to level the playing field for U.S. manufacturers and to ensure that taxpayers get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of jobs in this country and reductions in pollution. So happy to engage in a further conversation with you.
Okay, that'd be great. And anything you can supply would be helpful. I yield back.
Woman yields back, and thank you. The chair now recognizes the Subcommittee Chair of Oversight of the Standing Committee, Representative DeGette of Colorado, for 5 minutes.
Thank you
Chair
so
DeGette,
much.
please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and for your important legislation as well, because I think workforce transition is really important for everybody to have. We had a hearing last week in my subcommittee and the Oversight Subcommittee about, it was actually about the EPA, but the issue of transitioning in coal-related communities came up with in a very powerful way with a witness actually from West Virginia. And he was talking about the disruption we're seeing in coal-dependent communities. But frankly, Mr. Walsh, I'd like to go with you. I'd like to start with you. This disruption we're seeing in these communities is not necessarily as a result of environmental laws, but of changing market forces where natural gas, wind, and solar energy are out competing coal, even in the absence of a federal climate policy. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, Congresswoman. And in fact, over the 4 years of the Trump presidency, we saw coal mining jobs continue to decline and coal production hitting its lowest levels since the 1960s, as both utilities and consumers continue to shift to cleaner and cheaper forms of energy.
And surely under the Trump administration, that was not due to federal energy policies. In fact, the president told the coal miners that he would preserve their jobs, and I believe he wanted to preserve their jobs, but the market just is shifting away from coal. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. I would call that a false promise, which raised some false hopes, unfortunately.
But what is a real situation, though, is in these communities, people are losing their jobs. And I don't think we can brush that under the rug. We need to figure out something to do, which is why we're discussing this bill today. Would that be fair?
That would be fair. And actually, I think your state of Colorado provides something of an example in that regard.
Well, thank you for raising that, because in Colorado, we have the Colorado Office for Just Transition, and that's been a model for important elements of my bill and the Clean Future Act. Are you familiar with that Colorado initiative?
Yes, we had the pleasure of working with Colorado policymakers and our allies to craft the legislation that created that office.
And can you briefly describe for folks what that does?
Sure. What it does is to set up a centralized Office of Just Transition within state government in Colorado to play a role that's actually quite analogous to the office that's established under Title X at a federal level of the Clean Future Act, basically aligning, coordinating, in particular, different economic and workforce development programs across state government to invest in coal communities and workers and provide support for those communities and workers. I think it's really worth flagging that they will be the first to tell you that they can't do that alone as a state, that the federal government has to be a full partner, particularly when it comes to making investments in workers and communities.
Well, and also Colorado has a much more diverse economy than just coal, for example. So you really need a unified national plan to help states like West Virginia and other states that have an economy much more dependent on coal. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
Yes, and in fact, I think the hallmark of transition is that it happens very differently in very different parts of the country, and it's based on the economic profile of that community or region and the labor markets of that community and region.
Some of the efforts in the past to retrain workers in coal and other energy dependent communities have not succeeded. Can you tell us a little bit about why those programs haven't succeeded, and what would be different about an initiative like the one we're discussing today?
We could talk about that for a while, Congresswoman. I will just say really quickly that it's absolutely critical that we link job training, workforce development with economic development and economic diversification, because it doesn't do any good to train people for jobs that aren't there. And unfortunately, it's characteristic of coal-reliant communities that they have a very narrow economic base, which is one of the reasons we need to invest in those communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you on these issues, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chair DeGette. And we now will recognize Representative Johnson of Ohio for 5 minutes, please. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go a little bit of a different direction in my questions. You know, I know that some of my friends on the Republican side today will argue this legislation is a Green New Deal light. But I'd argue that this is actually the tactical implementation plan for the Green New Deal. It's the Green New Deal put into action. The Green New Deal in its current form is a short but broad resolution outlining the dangerous and unworkable goals of the radical environmental left. But what we're discussing today, the 900+ page Clean Future Act, fills in a lot of the blanks. Today, we're discussing decarbonizing industrial sectors. And unfortunately, this legislation is filled with top-down mandates and one-size-fits-all incentives instead of adopting a true market-driven, all-of-the-above approach, letting American entrepreneurs and innovators lead the way, which is what American workers are so well known for. If implemented, we'll look awfully foolish a decade or so from now, millions of tons of carbon-intensive manufactured materials and billions of dollars later, only to find out that advanced nuclear technologies have arrived that can provide zero carbon power, including innovative industrial applications with a fraction of the resources my Democratic colleagues want to use for large-scale wind and solar. So, Mr. Sunday, your examples of the economic vitality in Pennsylvania are encouraging, especially the central role and all of the above energy approach has played there. I've seen it across the border in my state of Ohio as well. We need more American energy innovation expanding into industrial uses, but I'm worried we aren't focusing on the right policies today. Removing unnecessary barriers and modernizing licensing is critical, which is why I reintroduced the Strengthening American Nuclear Competitiveness Act. This legislation would improve our strategic competitiveness in nuclear technology and will facilitate investment in U.S. nuclear technology by our allies. It'll promote efficient licensing for new industrial uses of nuclear energy and for new techniques to help build American nuclear reactors faster, safer, and at lower cost. Advanced small modular reactors under development are capable of being safely placed next to existing industrial infrastructure. So imagine the uses of these applications to produce hydrogen or generate heat with zero emissions. After all, isn't that the ultimate goal of the Green New Deal, zero emissions? So, Mr. Sunday, does this sound like a sound policy? And could you see these innovations in nuclear technology coupled with the diverse industrial and manufacturing industries in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and across the country?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, I think you're exactly right. That's the type of building on the traditional industries and knowledge base we have. What comes to mind for me is we have great research institutions like Penn State and Carnegie Mellon who are graduating nuclear engineering students who want to be involved in a growing industry, and advanced nuclear capabilities into their manufacturing space could be just that. That lets them stay in states like ours and grow the domestic base in high energy uses, whether that's refining, whether that's hydrogen, whether that's nanotechnology, whether that's data centers, all the back end of the cloud computing that we take for granted. Again, a lot of things that we rely on, there's a high energy use, and it's very possible in the future that advanced nuclear fits that. And there's really no credible zero carbon strategies out there that wouldn't include carbon capture and advanced nuclear. And it's important that we keep those options on the table.
Well, thank you. Mr. Walsh, do your members believe nuclear technology should be part of the clean energy solution?
The partners of BGA believe that zero emission electricity, and nuclear, of course, is an example of that, are absolutely critical to achieving net zero by 2050.
Good. Mr. Perciasepi, how about you?
I have to remember to unmute. I'm here today speaking on behalf of the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, and we feel, let me just say quickly, that we feel a significant amount of the lower energy thermal needs of the industrial sector can quickly and easily, with some incentives, be decarbonized with renewable energy. But speaking as a general matter to your bigger question beyond why I'm here today, of course, some of the higher temperature issues in industry will need other technologies, and we see incentives for those in these bills. In this bill.
Okay, all right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I've extended my period, so I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, Representative Schakowsky, for 5 minutes. Representative Schakowsky from Illinois, you're recognized now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Since 1999, the EPA voluntary Energy Star program has been in effect, and as someone who has absolutely taken advantage of that when I bought some washer dryer appliances, I think it's really terrific. And I know that we now have are looking at, as part of the legislation we're talking about, a Energy Star program. And I want to just tell you how important it could be to an important business in my district. There's a major cement manufacturer, Lafarge. It is headquartered in my district, and so I'm especially interested in this new program because they have both a decarbonized version of their product and the one that has been traditionally used. And the costs are pretty similar, but there is no way to distinguish them and to encourage the use of the less carbonized version. So Ms. Dell, if you could elaborate on the Climate Star program, and you know, I think people know I'm not always for voluntary, but this seems to be working, doesn't it? Or it certainly has in terms of the Energy Star program. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Pardon me.
Bless you.
Thank you so much for the question. So this bill contains a provision for something called Climate Star, which is closely analogous to Energy Star, but looks at greenhouse gas emissions instead of energy consumption per se. This is a particularly important distinction in the cement industry, which you mentioned, because if you imagine, for example, if you use carbon capture and storage to reduce your emissions, you might not reduce your energy consumption, but you would still be a climate star, even if you weren't an Energy Star. So one thing that has been a real barrier to the broader diffusion of existing lower carbon alternatives has actually been the public sector's reluctance to use it in public construction. And that exists at the state, federal, and local level. So Climate Star will provide information and transparency and allow customers for cement to feel confident that the thing they're buying is actually better for the climate than the conventional alternative, but it will be even more effective paired with the broader Buy Clean requirements that will move the public sector from being a laggard to being a leader on this issue.
Thank you so much. You mentioned the issue of transparency, and I wanted to ask Mr. Walsh, from your organization's perspective, why are the transparency measures in the Clean Future program so important? Mr. Walsh?
Because we need the data. We need to know the emissions intensity of these different products. We need to verify it, and we need to learn from it. The system that it builds on, that is already being used by many manufacturers, environmental product declarations, is called out in the bill. I think we also need, through the Buy Clean program, to understand whether that fully captures life cycle emissions and emissions connected to transportation. But data is absolutely going to be critical, and we're not going to get it without full transparency.
So that is a requirement, not a voluntary, right? In the bill.
Yeah, I mean, it all builds on transparency. We have to have that in place as a foundation for the rest of the program to move forward.
Well, thank you very much. And I just have a few seconds, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. We now recognize Representative Duncan of South Carolina. Representative, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, what's anything going on the floor? Right.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ms. DeJette from Colorado for mentioning market forces and how they actually affect what the United States and other countries do with regard to climate versus government regulations. But I want to address some of the ramifications from an environmental security and competitiveness standpoint. Should we pursue market manipulating globalist policies supported by President Biden and mimic in the Democrats' Clean Futures Act? I agree with President Biden's Buy American agenda, but that starts with buying American energy and supporting policies to create an environment conducive to supporting American manufacturing. The Clean Futures Act and most all energy and environmental policy coming out of the Biden administration undercuts the Buy America idea across the board. We don't give enough credit to the environmental progress the U.S. has made as a result of the American energy renaissance. We got here by innovation in the energy industry, not through mandates and regulations. The United States has become the #1 oil and gas producer in the world, while simultaneously outpacing most of the world in reducing emissions. In 2019, U.S. emissions reached their lowest level since 1992. Market forces drove this, not government policies. I want to thank Mr. Johnson from Ohio for discussing the role that nuclear power and innovation plays in lowering our carbon footprint while also providing very good paying jobs within the energy sector. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm delivered her first international address as Energy Secretary this week. And she said the U.S. should replicate Germany's 50% renewables. But the fallacy in that is this. So she's holding Germany out as the model the U.S. should follow. The fallacy is this: Germany began shutting down all their nuclear power plants after Fukushima. They only have a handful, I think 7 operating now, and are all scheduled to close. Germany imports electricity from France, which 75% of which is generated from nuclear power. It's the only way Germany's renewables actually work. The only way Germany can get to the 50% or lower renewables is by importing French nuclear generated electricity. The price of German electricity is twice that of the average French household. Germany's shift to renewables is why countries like Poland are also looking to expand their electricity generation capacity by adding nuclear power plants. They know they can make a fortune off selling power to Germany because of Germany's desire to feel good and their pretension of being green. And so if we're talking about global carbon reductions and global energy, nuclear power has got to be a big part of this. Mr. Sunday, you note that as we develop new technology solutions in both fossil and zero carbon resources, it's imperative trade and energy policies support the continued export of these solutions to developing countries. I couldn't agree more. We can help improve the lives of people across the globe by exporting U.S. energy sources, clean burning natural gas that helps them have electricity and get off of the more climate producing, dirtier energy. Can you speak to some of the geopolitical ramifications of the U.S. not exporting our energy? Mr. Sunday.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. There's a few. India is a growing market, carbon intensive. 1 billion people there want reliable, low carbon energy. LNG is an answer there. In the Middle East, we've seen some turmoil for decades. It was always the Strait of Hormuz. If an oil tanker went down, it was cause for war. We had that recently, 2 springs ago, and because of the LNG assets, it's given greater optionality that we didn't descend into another war over that because we're less reliant on those fuels. Sending LNG to Southeast Asia shores up their security, reduces their footprints, and have to rely less on Chinese and Russian energy. And the same goes for our allies in Eastern Europe. And we're landing LNG in Spain, in the Mediterranean and Turkey. And that's allowing them to have the option of turning away and saying, no, Russia, we'd rather have energy from a country that's interested in democracy.
There's no doubt about that. And look, Russia and China are way ahead of us on emerging nuclear technologies. The United States need to get in gear. We are a true leader in nuclear power, but instead of dealing with bills like the Clean Future Act, we need to put our resources toward modernization and innovation in the nuclear power realm and exporting that. It's less carbon footprint, cleaner burning. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland. Representative Sarbanes, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening today's hearing on the Clean Future Act. I want to thank the witnesses for their very valuable testimony. I'm particularly interested today in the focus on communities, and in particular how the Clean Future Act can take action to protect and uplift communities across the country and in my state of Maryland. I represent parts of Baltimore, which, as many of you here know, was once a thriving industrial hub. Over time, that base shrank, unfortunately creating a lot of economic hardship across many communities, and it's vital that we have conversations like we are today on how you can revitalize and reinvigorate our local economies. The Clean Future Act does more than just start that conversation. I have to say it takes action. The measures like the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator and the community transition provisions in Title 10 are an example of this. It's a promise to invest in economically distressed communities across the country. And these investments and programs can bring new clean industries to places like Baltimore, which in turn would create jobs, expand economic opportunity, and so forth. Mr. Perciasepe, first of all, thank you for all your incredible work over the years, your career of commitment on the environment, your service in the past, the state of Maryland, which we're all very proud of. Can you speak to the Accelerator's potential to jumpstart investment in clean and innovative industries, especially in parts of our country that have seen this kind of decline in industrial activity?
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman, for that question and for the shout out. Baltimore is a very important place in my heart. You know, there are a number of provisions in the Futures Act that really address and look at the paramount issue that we need to have in a decarbonizing world. And that is how to strengthen American industry and American manufacturing in that environment. So you have things like the Clean Energy Manufacturing Grant Program, which has a focus on small and modest sized businesses. But you also have the Clean Energy Sustainability Accelerator, which has provisions in it to not just look at funding a particular technology, but also funding a economic development around a decarbonized future for our manufacturing and industrial sector. And here's where a facility like the Accelerator can not only stimulate innovation, which I think is paramount, but also pull in private capital, giving the confidence that the federal government is there with them. Private capital will be needed as well as we look at these communities and a broader economic development program. So I think the Accelerator has a lot of mechanisms and has a lot of authority in the bill to look at those things more broadly and provide that broader economic development stimulus, which I think will be essential for not only urban areas, but also rural areas, as agriculture and forestry are also part of that.
Thank you very much. I think it's a terrific idea, this Accelerator. And I'd emphasize your phrasing here that it can help stimulate innovation, because we hear this suggestion that somehow the federal government is trying to become the chief innovator and crowd out or push away all of the sort of private sector innovators out there that are getting things started. That's not what we're doing here. We want to stimulate innovation in creative ways. And the federal government has done that many times before and can do it through this Accelerator program. I've got about 45 seconds left, but Mr. Walsh, maybe you can speak as well to what you think the potential offered through the Accelerator program is.
I mean, I think it's significant, and I just want to say that we strongly support the prioritization of investments in the Accelerator to disproportionately impacted communities. We think that's really essential, not just in Baltimore, but across the country. I think we would love to work with you to broaden the definition of what constitutes qualified projects, but I think as written, this is a really great start.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
You're most welcome. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Representative Curtis. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pallone, in his opening remarks, reminded us that science was to be our impetus. And I'm not a scientist, so at a very surface level, I'd like to look at the science of the Clean Future Act. Now, let's suppose hypothetically, just hypothetically, that we take a moonshot and we're able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to zero. Hypothetically, not by 2050, but by 2030. So I ask, and it's somewhat of a rhetorical question, I ask the members of this committee and our witnesses, what would be the impact on worldwide greenhouse gas emissions if we were 100% successful with that moonshot? Now, looking at the Paris Accord, you'll know where I'm going. China will reach its peak of carbon emissions in 2030. And so I believe the science tells us that even if we're wildly successful, we will fail in our goal of reducing worldwide carbon emissions, even if this bill is implemented. And we all know that there would be more carbon in the air, not less, because of these other countries. And any one of our witnesses that would like to dispute that or tell me I'm wrong, I'd love to hear from you. And I believe that's because in the name of the US showing leadership, we're proposing that the US sacrifice US jobs, and at the same time, we're willing to give a pass to a human rights violating dictator. And let's be honest, in the year 2030, the US could take our greenhouse gas emissions to zero, and we would fail in what I believe is a shared goal of reducing worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Mr. Sunday, the US, as I'm told, has reduced emissions more in the last decade than the next 12 emission-reducing countries combined. In your testimony, you said something, and it caught my attention. And you said, I'm paraphrasing, no country has the story to tell like the United States. Why aren't we telling the story, Mr. Sunday? Why don't we hear this? In your opinion, why aren't we shouting this from the housetops?
Well, that's in part why I'm so honored to be here today to help let folks know what Pennsylvania's done to contribute to that story. It's a story that can't be told. It's a story we shouldn't be ashamed of, and it's trends that we should want to continue. Continued emissions reductions, outpacing the developed world on growth, and keeping consumers' energy costs low. That's adding 3 for 3.
Yeah, I've got a theory, and I'd like to ask you if you feel like you could verify it. We could lower more greenhouse gas emissions by exporting US natural gas to China and India than by implementing the Clean Future Act. Do you have a response to that?
Not having an advanced degree in mathematics, intuitively, yes, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I would generally agree with that, yeah.
And so like this whole concept of like, we don't need to kill fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, according to your testimony, is our secret weapon to dramatically lower worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm quite limited on time, but I'd like to kind of switch gears for a minute. And Mr. Walsh, I've listened carefully to your testimony, and I believe you are very, very sincere in your desire to help these communities. I represent a county, and the name of that county is called Carbon County. So you can imagine what they do in this county. And I watch closely the exchange between you and Representative DeGette about how programs have not succeeded there. Are you aware of any programs that have succeeded in these coal countries? And I don't know that you need to elaborate all of them now, but are we being successful anywhere in this concept?
I believe we have a lot of really promising examples from the Power Grant program that we started during the Obama administration, continued through the Trump administration. A lot of that was focused on Appalachia for a bunch of reasons, in part because we didn't have a whole of government approach and an office at the White House. We had a harder time driving investment to coal communities out west in the district that you represent. I think there are many examples out there. Be happy to share some of them with you for the record, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to run out of time, so I would love to do that offline with you because I share this goal with you, and I have a theory in this regards too, is that one of the problems is that our dialogue so often villainizes these people in coal country, and that's a hard way to start. Does that make sense? And I'd love us to think about how we address these communities and how they feel before we even come in with these plans because of this villainization. I regret that I'm out of time. I'd love to explore that more offline with you.
Well, the chairman indulged me just to respond to that. I want to strongly agree with you, Congressman. In fact, we need to start from the premise that workers in these communities themselves have kept the lights on in this country for generations. They deserve our respect. They deserve our support, which is exactly why we need the kind of policy constructs envisioned by Title 10 of the Clean Future Act. So we'd love to continue that conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Peters. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to begin by acknowledging some of the comments from my colleagues on the other side. Of course, we have to work internationally to solve this problem. I certainly don't disagree with that. I believe there's a role for nuclear. I believe there's a role for looking at streamlining permitting, particularly for renewables. And I'd love to work with you on all that stuff. But I do have to make the one comment again about reducing our emissions. It is great that we reduce our emissions by the use of natural gas, but let's remember that all of the climate benefits of natural gas are lost unless we deal with methane. And I'm talking to my colleagues about that as well. So I think we should not break our arms patting ourselves on the back about natural gas without dealing very frankly with the methane threat. I did want to talk to Dr. Dell and in particular about the comment you made in your testimony. In order for Buy Clean to be as successful as possible, it should be complemented by investments in innovation and the commercialization of strategic new technologies in the industrial sector. And I couldn't agree with you more. As you well know, concrete is the second most used material on Earth after water, and its main binding ingredient, Portland cement, accounts for fully 7% of global carbon emissions. The Buy Clean program in the Futures Act would require building materials and products procured with federal funds to achieve a minimum GHG standard. This provides a strong incentive to reduce the quantity of embodied carbon emissions, and similar to California's buy clean threshold model. Our buy clean approach goes one step further and includes a program called the Climate Star program that would establish a voluntary labeling mechanism to identify and promote products with significantly lower embodied emissions than comparable products while meeting strict performance standards in order to reduce GHG emissions and encourage the use of products with lower embodied emissions. I think that's great. I do have to acknowledge that one of the most popular sports in this committee is to beat up on California. I have to say, I heard about rolling blackouts. No one's changed their talking points apparently since Texas had their problems. But let me just say that I heard about a buy clean model in New York and New Jersey. So I'd like to talk about that and see whether you thought that was a good approach. It's called the Low Embodied Concrete Leadership Act, or LECLA. And the basic concept is that concrete producers would bid on public projects based on the global warming potential values of their concrete in addition to costs. And those with the highest performing global warming potential scores get a discount rate applied to their bid price, making their bids functionally less expensive and more competitive relative to lower performing bids. For products that use any carbon capture, utilization, or storage technologies to manufacture their concrete, a discount would be applied. And my interest in this is that it might actually incentivize producers to work beyond any threshold that we might set if the incentive was good enough. So I wanted to hear if you're familiar with the bill, what you thought the benefits of that approach might be, and how approach like this might fit into existing legislation and plans. Dr. Dell.
Thank you so much for the question, Congressman Peters. And if you'll indulge me, I'll say I used to be your constituent back when I was a scientist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
If you indulge me, I'm sympathetic that you had to move someplace else.
You know, I remember at the time one of my colleagues commenting that when it came to lifestyle, we're the 1%. San Diego's a very beautiful part of the world. But on your substantive question, I think that the broad point that you're making is incredibly important. That what we need in our Buy Clean programs is to both ensure that everybody is using current best practices, but also that we're providing incentives for people to innovate, for people to do new things and to get new and even better than current best practices systems in place and to make that profitable. And so I actually think that the New York and New Jersey model is fantastic. I'm a big fan of it. And my reading of the Clean Futures Act, this title of the Clean Futures Act, tells me that the current legislative text retains a lot of flexibility about exactly how the program would be structured, that ideally would be used to both incentivize innovation and current best practice.
Thank you. I've run out of time. I went on too long, but I would just say that although I always like complimenting California, my subcommittee chair and full committee chair might like an idea from New York and New Jersey. So I think we should pursue it. And I yield back.
The gentleman is absolutely right. We would appreciate that. And he yields back. So now the chair will recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Representative Palmer. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sunday, the hearing is about creating jobs and working communities. Would banning the development of natural gas and other fossil fuels create jobs, support working communities in Pennsylvania?
No, that would cause an enormous economic disruption to our state.
Think that would be true in other states?
Yes.
I think that if we just completely eliminated the production of steel and petrochemicals, that the world would just quit using steel and petrochemicals?
No, and that speaks to the folly of supply side interventions. There's still a demand globally for these products, and it does us no good to lose the domestic base and just have them manufactured somewhere else.
Next question is, do you think that these would simply move offshore, as so many of our industries did during the Obama administration? And You think that might happen?
Yes, that is quite likely.
Can you briefly discuss how NEPA prevents newer and cleaner infrastructure from being built?
Sure. We're part of the Unlock American Investment Coalition, which includes all sorts of builders groups, contractors, manufacturers, developers. If a federally approved or federally permitted project touches NEPA, we're looking on upwards of 5 years for the federal agency to get the paperwork done on that. On transportation infrastructure projects, it's upwards of 7 or 8 years. We've got a rail project outside of Philadelphia to expand public transit that's been under NEPA review since 2012. If we want to upgrade our infrastructure, we've got to get our act together on permitting.
I think the same thing would apply if we wanted to upgrade our electric grid. I assume that most of my Democrat colleagues are aware that we don't have one single grid, that it's a patchwork, and it would be enormously expensive to replace that grid. I want to talk a little bit more about under Title V of the Clean Future Act. We'll spend billions of dollars to support manufacturing clean energy technologies and components. Some of the covered technology and components likely include batteries for electric vehicles and solar panels. Both of those require substantial amounts of critical rare earth materials. If we're not mining in the U.S. for these materials, where are we going to get them?
Well, at present, most of the mining and refining base for those products is China. You mentioned the word rare. They're definitely critical. We have some of those assets here. The problem is a lot of folks are opposing new mining and refining for those types of minerals. So absolutely, smart national energy policy would encourage mining of these types of materials domestically.
We've just established, I think, that if this bill were to pass and become law, that a lot of these industries would move offshore to other countries. Everything from steel manufacturing, petrochemicals, to mining and production and refinement of rare earth metals, probably to China and other India and some other places. Do you have an idea of what their records are, what their laws are regarding environmental issues, emissions, things like that?
Yeah, I think a cursory look of their emissions output per GDP, much more carbon intensive, much more particulate matter and soot coming out of their factories. And it's an issue that makes its way across the Pacific and contributes to why some of our Western states have such persistent ozone issues, because there's so much air pollution from international sources that we still feel the impacts of, believe it or not, halfway across the world.
Are you aware that according to the EPA, up to 25% on any given day of the air pollution, the particulate matter over the skies of Los Angeles are from China, and they project in a few years 30% of all of the emissions over the state of California will be from China. And also, we had a hearing on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and I asked the Democrat witnesses, all three of whom were scientists, one of whom was one of the lead authors and editors of the International Panel on Climate Change report, and I asked them if we completely eliminated all CO2 emissions, went to absolute zero in the U.S. and the entire world, would it stop climate change? And the answer was no. So I might suggest that if this were to become law, we implement it only in Democrat congressional districts and see how that works out. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Representative Dingell. You're welcome to question now for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko, and thanks for having this important hearing on the Clean Futures Act. From the industrial sector prevents both technical and financial challenges. And I'm from the Midwest and I'm watching this happen. But there are solutions to those challenges, and I'm thrilled that this hearing is focused on such solutions. One of the solutions which I'm proud to be spearheading. And sustainable Accelerator. The Accelerator is based on the Green Bank model that's been successfully deployed across cities and states, including my own home state of Michigan. Similar legislation passed the House twice last Congress, and so thank you for including it in the Clean Future Act again. Capitalized with $100 billion over a 6-year period, the Accelerator will leverage public and private funds to invest in low and zero carbon technologies, clean infrastructure, buildings and transportation, sustainable agriculture, and so much more. It would also support the development of new state and local green banks, and importantly, it would direct 40% of investments to communities on the front lines of climate change, a key pillar of the Thrive agenda. And I'd like to thank the Coalition for Green Capital for all their help in developing and advancing the bill. Mr. Perciasepi, your testimony outlines some of the benefits of establishing the Accelerator, particularly for the industrial sector. Can you elaborate on how this type of financing institution differs from other tools in our toolbox? Why it is so important for us to establish a program like the Accelerator to help overcome barriers to financing projects that reduce emissions in the U.S.?
Yeah, Congressman, thank you so much for that question and all that you've been doing working on these issues. Let me just give a few highlights of that. Otherwise, we could spend the rest of the hearing on it. But the key thing here, and you've already outlined it, is the holistic approach taken here of this financial facility. It looks not just at a particular kind of technology or a particular kind of service. It looks at all of it. It's combined. That has to be pulled together to really make sure that we strengthen our economic situation and our economic development as we move forward. It also has the ability, as you pointed out, to help facilitate local financial facilities, but more importantly, sends a huge signal to the private markets. We've talked a lot on this hearing so far about market mechanisms versus command and control. Well, here is a massive market mechanism. Once the federal government makes this kind of significant commitment, which in today's dollars isn't a lot different than what we did in the moonshot, and we send that signal to the private sector, as you've pointed out, it's going to leverage hundreds of billions of dollars of private investment, which is what we need. The last point I'll make, we have innovation going on in this country. When innovators are working, one of the things they see in their future is, what do I do? How do I get it commercialized? How do I move to the point where things can be implemented? This facility has the ability to take the innovation and that's developed in research and development programs and move it to that next level. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and we're very supportive.
Mr. Perciasepi, I have a ton of questions and I'm almost out of time. So let me ask you one more. Can you explain, Mr. Chairman, I want to do some for the record, but can you explain why and how a program like the Accelerator is so critical to unleashing private investment in clean technology and infrastructure, especially in areas of our economy like the industrial sector?
Yes. Well, certainly the industrial sector is one of the more difficult to visualize how we're going to deal with the great diversity of industrial processes that go on there. Some of those have been mentioned already, including, for instance, Lafarge Holcim and cement manufacturing. The idea of being able to assist in those very varied ways in a more holistic approach with something like the Accelerator is really going to provide that impetus for that public-private partnership and drive the market forces of private investment in the same direction. So I could give you a lot longer explanation of that. I'd be happy to reply for the record when you send those questions.
I will do that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back 0 seconds.
Thank you so much. The gentlewoman yields back. Next, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia. Representative Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being part of this most important discussion. Mr. Perciasepi, I want to ask you, Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the nation. We have more forestry than any other state in the nation. It's extremely important to us, and biomass is something that we have really concentrated on. In fact, we have biomass plants in my district that provide biomass for a number of different industries, as well as we send biomass for heating purposes to Europe, and they use a lot of it as well. So I wanted to ask you, during the Obama administration, the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation had sent out a memorandum in November of 2014 on the carbon benefits of forest-derived biomass. And the memorandum said, and I quote, use of waste-derived feedstocks and certain forest-derived feedstocks are likely to have minimal or no net atmospheric contributions of biogenic CO2 emissions, or even reduce such impacts when compared with an alternative fate of disposal. I know that you've written op-eds as well. In fact, I think you wrote an op-ed in The Hill almost a year ago, citing the benefits of biomass. And I wanted to ask you, since you've noted and EPA has noted that that the decarbonization benefits of forest-derived biomass, do you agree that it makes sense for the EPA to recognize the benefits of bioenergy produced from forest products that are manufacturers?
Oh, I'm still unmuted. Great. Yes. You know, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative lists biomass as one of the key components of the options available to decarbonize parts of the thermal needs of American manufacturing and industry. The counterbalance to that, and what is always the hang-up in everybody's analysis, in my op-ed, not representing the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, but representing myself, pointed out that most of the forest land in the United States is privately owned, and to maintain those forests, there needs to be an economic incentive for those forests to be maintained. And so finding that balance of all the proper sustainable forestry practices to assure that the balance is correct in terms of the carbon neutrality of the use of those forest products is what the discussion is about. And I'm confident that we as a country can work through that. And I think some of the innovation that will be stimulated by some of the provisions in this bill can, I hope, help move those industries closer together.
Well, I appreciate you saying that very much. I serve on the Select Committee for Climate Change, and I have sometimes I run up against a brick wall when I talk about biomass as being carbon neutral, and people just don't want to accept it, but it is carbon neutral. And if you think about it, you know, with sustainable forest and everything that we're doing with our forest here in America, that is certainly an egg in the egg basket, if you will, that we need to be using to fight carbon emissions. Would you agree?
Look, we need to preserve the American forest and allow even additional forests to grow. And this is another whole conversation. And again, I think there's some incentives in this bill that will stimulate innovation in this area. But whether it's 100% carbon neutral or 93% carbon neutral or 95%, that can be determined. And I'm going to guess here, without any scientific analysis, that there'll be some discounting there because of transportation issues and other things, but and management practices. But certainly there's significant benefits, and certainly the Renewable Thermal Collaborative that I'm representing today sees biomass as an important component of decarbonizing industrial heat.
Great. Well, thank you for that very much. I appreciate it. Mr. Sunday, very quickly, because I'm running out of time here. Under Title IX of this bill, all permits would essentially be stopped for plastic. And not only that, but this means that recycling of plastics would also be stopped. How is that going to impact killing the recycling cutting edge technology that we're working on? How is that going to provide us a realistic path forward?
It would do nothing but shoot ourselves in the foot. And again, calls us to rely on manufacturing in other countries.
Right. Well, I'm out of time, but thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Representative Balagan. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair Tonko, for holding this important hearing in reducing industrial emissions and a just transition. This is an important issue for me. My district has heavy industry including oil refineries in Carson, California and Wilmington, California, that pollute the air in, let's say, majority Latino and African American communities. But also these jobs support our union jobs. As we transition away from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy, it's critical we make the necessary investments to ensure that every community can breathe clean air and that no worker is left behind. Mr. Perciasepi, the industrial sector is a significant contributor for greenhouse gas emissions, and it's also a major cause of environmental injustice in low-income communities and communities of color. Can you describe how electrifying industry and increasing the amount of clean energy used by the industrial sector can help to reduce the impact of pollution in communities?
Yes, again, thank you for that question. As I mentioned in my testimony, the industrial sector is one of the more complicated ones to decarbonize because of the diversity of the different manufacturing processes. But here, but almost 50% of the emissions are coming from the need for heat. And heat is something that is ubiquitous across all industrial sectors. They need to heat things or to create products, to dry them, to for all different needs. But how that heat is created is about 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions. I'm rounding here, it might be upper 40%. And so reducing the emissions from that heat, which many have already done, has been pointed out here. There's been some fuel switching to cleaner natural gas, but there's a real opportunity to continue to use things like electrification, using renewable energy for that, or biomass, as I was just talking about, but with all, obviously, with the proper pollution controls on it. The other place that's really important, Congresswoman, is in the innovation of the industrial processes. How can those industrial processes be modified to reduce the emissions that they produce as well? And I think looking at that holistically are what some of the measures in the Clean Futures bill tries to do.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's helpful to look at, incentives that can be helpful in reducing emissions and setting standards for different sectors of our economy. It's critical to reducing fossil fuel usage and reaching 100% clean energy. We already have fuel economy standards for transportation, and the Clean Future Act proposes a clean electricity standard for utilities. Should we also have standards for the industrial sector to address climate and environmental justice issues? And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what that would look like.
Well, certainly the thermal part of the industrial sector can be subjected to performance standards similar to a clean energy standard. There's still energy being used, but the industrial process part of it, the making of cement, the cracking of chemicals at a refinery to make plastics and other goods, the moving of iron ore to elemental iron. All of these things require not only heat, but also they have chemical processes. And so those processes aren't able to, there's innovation that can be occurring there that will help reduce those emissions. But a clean energy type standard or performance standard could be applied to the thermal aspects of industrial heat.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh, in California, there are 35,000 abandoned oil wells sitting idle, many leaking methane and harmful chemicals in communities of color. Across the country, there are millions of abandoned wells. Could investing in oil field communities to plug and remediate these wells be part of a just transition program that creates immediate job opportunities?
Quickly, absolutely. It has the combined effect of cleaning up polluted sites, but also creating jobs in the short term. Let me just speak to your other question. I think one of the most important opportunities provided by pursuing solutions around industrial decarbonization is to also reduce criteria pollutants from the industrial sector. And there are ways in which of deploying technologies that can do both. And that's what's so exciting, I think, about this industrial title.
Great, thank you, sir. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas. Representative Crenshaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Look, I want to focus on costs and benefits and trade-offs. Policymaking is about trade-offs, not necessarily solutions. And when you have a preferred solution in mind, well, there's a large incentive to exaggerate problems, exaggerate benefits associated with that solution, and diminish the costs associated with that. So there's a lot of things to cover here. I want to hit the transition of jobs, or the supposed transition of jobs. The reality is that this bill creates one job, and that is a director of a task force that would supposedly transition workers to green energy jobs. The problem is, and this has already been acknowledged in this hearing, that if there's no opportunity on the other end of that, well, these government programs never work. The Washington Post had to fact check John Kerry using Bureau of Labor Statistics data when John Kerry claimed that the fastest growing jobs in America, or some of them, were renewable energy jobs. Here's the thing, by percentage wise, that might be true, but in reality, when you actually look at the absolute numbers, it's only about 10,000 new jobs over the next 10 years. Here's the other thing. These jobs on average pay about $20,000 less than oil and gas jobs. This idea that we're just going to transition jobs is a myth. It is a fantasy. I wanted to hit on the Buy Clean program, and this question will be directed to Ms. Dell. Just a quick question. If the plan was implemented perfectly, okay, we didn't lose any industry, let's say, which of course is quite the assumption, how much would we actually reduce carbon emissions?
Thanks so much for the question. The first thing I would say is that one of the most important aspects of Buy Clean is that it has no incentive whatsoever to offshore production. Exactly the same standards are applied to overseas production.
Please answer the question I asked. If we had an hour, I would love to talk with you, but please answer the question that I asked.
Sure, that's all I wanted to say. And so building materials in the US represent a few percent of our total emissions. So if we brought those to zero, we might see an impact of a few 100 million tons of CO2.
Okay, so a few percent, meaning 3% of US emissions?
Well, that depends very sensitively on how much money Congress decides to spend on infrastructure.
Let's say it's 10%. All right, let's say we reduce US emissions by 10%. US emissions account for about 15% of global emissions. This would equal about 1% decrease in global emissions, which is kind of nothing, practically speaking, at a huge cost. I realize you claim that there's no cost to this. I noticed you said that in your testimony too, but you did not cite any references. Do you have any references now for why there would be no cost? Have you consulted with industry about this?
Yeah, so in my written testimony, there are extensive footnotes which provide all the numbers. But I didn't say there would be no costs. I said the costs would be very modest.
Okay.
Typically,
I think a lot of people in industry would vehemently disagree. I want to move on and ask you another question.
Very modest compared to the cost of the infrastructure project, not necessarily very modest compared to the cost of the old way of making cement.
Okay, again, cost benefits is what I'm trying to get at. On plastic manufacturing, there's going to be a pause on new plants in the next 3 years. On this question, what benefits do we expect from doing that? Is the benefit directed towards emissions or plastics recycling? Are we afraid plastics are going in the ocean? What is the expected benefit?
So I was not invited to testify on the plastics title of the bill.
And does any other witness want to answer that question? Okay, well, I'm going to say it's both, right? I'm going to say that maybe my colleagues are expecting both. Okay, so it's emissions and we don't like plastic in the oceans. I don't like emissions. I want to reduce emissions. I also don't like plastic in the oceans. Here's the thing. Let's look at this study. Danish Ministry of Environment and Food found that you'd have to use a cotton bag 20,000 times just to have less environmental impact than a simple plastic bag. Now, look, I'm a millennial. I take that cotton bag to Whole Foods. I do, but I know I'm virtue signaling. I know that it's actually bad for the environment. We need to acknowledge this reality. In California, you can't get a plastic bag. Here's the other thing. If we're concerned about plastic in the oceans, let's be honest, you're in America, your straw isn't going into the ocean. It just isn't. 10 rivers contribute to 90% of plastic in the oceans. It's not your straw. Mr. Sunday, in my limited time left, can you hit this theme of the costs that are being ignored by this bill?
Sure. I think broadly speaking, when we see significant public intervention in the marketplace, you see a glut of the thing that the government's trying to buy and scarcity and high prices for the things that the market actually needs. So that's been an underexplored aspect of all this. If private companies management wanted to make a significant change, that we would need to see some modeling, some analysis, some real extensive understanding of trade-offs before we would jump on that sort of massive shift in approach on the private side. So from where we sit in Pennsylvania, like again, we've done everything we should be doing in terms of air quality, energy costs, and manufacturing, and we want to see those trends continue.
Thank you, and I yield back no time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Representative McEachin. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Chairman Pallone for your excellent leadership in this area and for the introduction of the Clean Future Act. You know, to my mind, there's nothing more important than combating our climate crisis. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It is the most important issue of the 21st century. We have exactly one opportunity to get it right, and we can't afford to miss the mark. I'll go ahead and skip right to my questions. Mr. Walsh, first of all, thank you for the wonderful and outstanding work that you and the others on the Blue-Green Alliance are doing. You previously worked on coordinating interagency efforts through the Power Initiative. Can you give us a sense of the importance of having a formalized process to reach across agencies and to incorporate stakeholder input in the design and implementation of federal programs? How critical is participation through an advisory committee, otherwise, of affected workers and community members to the success of these efforts? Two-part question.
A coordinated office is essential. What we did during the Obama administration, as you and I have talked about, was kind of ad hoc, kind of jury-rigged. I think we got a lot done, but what we were missing was a structural system in place that would allow different offices, different agencies to work together. So that was vitally important. On the point of public participation, look, you know, the best kind of economic development is from the bottom up, right? The way you get that is getting full buy-in and full participation from community members, economic developers, other stakeholders in local communities about their vision, their plan for the economic future of their community. So it's absolutely vital.
Thank you. That's a nice segue into my next question about empowering local leaders. Can the federal government play a role in a community-driven economic redevelopment by supporting capacity building, technical assistance, and financial support?
Yes, it can. And I think in Title 10, you see some clear examples of that. In particular, the establishment of essentially community hubs, right, that would put into practice what I just described about bottom-up planning and also really help navigate, help these local communities and workers navigate the federal resources that are out there. That, in my experience, is incredibly important.
Sir, I'm sure you'll agree with me that remediation is an awfully important aspect of what we have to do to get to where we need to be by 2050. The cleaning up of abandoned mines, Superfund sites, orphaned oil wells, orphaned gas wells, and brownfield sites. How can these remediation activities help provide jobs, protect public health, and lay the groundwork for future economic growth in these communities?
Well, I mean, they create jobs for a number of different trades in the cleanup itself, some of which is actually highly skilled. So there's an immediate job creation incentive right there. But it also recognizes that you're not really going to get economic development in places that are badly polluted, right? Businesses aren't going to locate there. New businesses aren't going to grow there. People aren't going to want to live there. If you've got a watershed, for example, that is poisoned by acid mine drainage, that is not an attractive place to build a new business or a new industry sector. So it is a vital precondition for economic diversification to clean up the mess that was left behind. I would also say, look, we talked about, we heard a little exchange before about costs. Let's also be clear that the costs of pollution, right? You know, the University of Minnesota issued a report in 2019 that found that poor air quality is responsible for more than 100,000 deaths in the United States due to heart attacks, strokes, lung cancer, and other diseases. And these, of course, are impacts that disproportionately impact communities of color and low-income communities. If we're going to have a full conversation about costs, we need to be talking about those costs as well, and cleaning up those costs, cleaning up that pollution, not only addresses that, but creates jobs and creates the conditions for sustainable, more resilient economic development.
Well, thank you for that very fine answer. You know, historically, we have undervalued the societal cost of pollution, and we appreciate you bringing our attention back to that. Mr. Chairman, I am out of time. I yield back.
Yeah, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Delaware, Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing on the Clean Future Act. And thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony today. As has been said, and as we all know, the climate crisis continues to threaten our country and the world. And in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need to move to a 100% clean energy future. Transitioning to a clean energy future is not only an imperative for our planet, but it's also an opportunity to rebuild our economy in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And millions of new construction, skilled trades, and engineering jobs needed to build a clean energy future will help us to create a cleaner, healthier, more equitable, and sustainable country. Mr. Walsh, I'd like to start with you. In response to Representative Crenshaw's question, and as someone who works closely with unions, how do you view the relationship between tackling the climate crisis and jobs? And does it create more net jobs or not? And then secondly, if you could just talk about how people from varying skills and educational levels will also be able to partake.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It is our view that rebuilding and repairing our infrastructure and our industrial base to be modern, safe, less polluting is an enormous job creation opportunity. We can cite different metrics. Some have actually been referenced in this committee in the past. But I want to emphasize just how much work will be involved in doing all of those things in the industrial sector, in the energy sector, in the building sector, as you know well, in environmental remediation. These are enormously big projects that we need to take on and that will create a lot of jobs. Now, the key is to make sure that the jobs created are high quality, and the jobs are accessible to the broadest range of the American people, right? And so we have some work to do in that regard. It is the case that the job quality of jobs that are in the wind and solar industries right now is really mixed. It's not good enough. But what that doesn't mean is that we should try to stand in the way of this transformation. What that means is that we should use well-established policy levers to improve the quality of jobs in those sectors, right? This act does that, right? It uses a prevailing wage. It uses project labor agreements. It uses community benefits. So I just want to be really clear about that point.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. And I think that it's important to say that this isn't easy work. As you may know, I served as Secretary of Labor in Delaware and also head of state personnel. And so jobs are a passion for me, which is why I created our first of its kind bipartisan Future of Work caucus in the Congress to look at challenges and opportunities. And earlier this week, just this week, I got to visit the Port of Wilmington, where they're showing us how they're using automation and ways to not displace workers. They've worked with the union with a guarantee that no one would lose their job, but they're also now being able to expand. And so in shifting to a clean energy future, how can we alleviate even some of the fears of automation in the industrial sector?
Talk to the bricklayers. What they will tell you is that, I mean, as folks who know, and you know, the construction trades, this is incredibly skilled work. It's also dangerous work and it's hard on the body, right? If you can surgically use robotics to lift things on a construction site, you are not only going to be increasing productivity, but you're going to be helping that bricklayer that is right next to that machine that is helping that person do their work. So I think that is part of the conversation that we need to be having.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Dell, what role does data play in our evolution to a clean energy future, and how can we use data to support our low carbon investments?
Thank you for the question. As has come up already in the hearing, data and transparency are going to be critical for this, because we want to design our policies to reward people and firms that are using the cleanest and most modern techniques. And in order to do that, we need to have accurate information about what is the environmental performance of not just domestic firms, but also international firms that want to participate in domestic markets.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. I want to thank the chairman for his leadership and his vision in this area. Thank you. I yield back.
Okay. Thank you very much. The gentlewoman yields back. Next, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Representative Soto. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start with a history lesson. Quote, as we sign this bill in this room, we can look back and say, in the Roosevelt room, on the last day of 1970, we signed a historic piece of legislation that put us far down the road toward a goal that Theodore Roosevelt, 70 years ago, spoke eloquently about, a goal of clean air, clean water, and open spaces for future generations of Americans. That was a quote by Republican President Richard Nixon during the Clean Air Act signing ceremony. When the Clean Air Act became law in 1970, it passed in the Senate unanimously, and only one person voted against it. One member of the House voted against it. What a shining environmental achievement. So what has happened since then? I realize this is hard for many of you, since there are major coal, oil, or gas industries in your states that provide jobs. And we need to work together to ensure transition in these communities, because we know why. We face a climate crisis. We must reduce carbon emissions to avoid intensifying hurricanes. We know that in Florida, rising sea levels. We also know that in Florida, extreme heat in the summer and extreme cold in the winter. Its effects are even worse. Our agriculture could start to fail and more Americans will go hungry. We can see the entire southern United States find themselves as climate refugees. Add political destabilization, war, and famine across the world, and you fully begin to understand the impacts that happen. In addition, I've heard countless arguments about China and India. Let me say it again. Their failures don't define American excellence. We do. And as we develop these technologies, we will sell them abroad and position ourselves for continued economic dominance in the 21st century. So once again, our nation has to come together with a comprehensive plan. That's what the Clean Futures Act is. It moves us towards carbon neutrality by 2050 with decarbonization of governments, transportation, utilities, manufacturing, and agriculture. And we will continue to convert our transportation system with electric vehicles. The fact that my colleagues across the aisle aren't motivated by the climate crisis, perhaps other things will motivate you, like the fact that the private sector is already moving forward with all this. Look no further than Ford or GM and the electric vehicles. They're rolling on the market faster than you could think. Millennials, the biggest generation, they're moving along. Consumer preferences, insurance companies, reinsurance markets, boardrooms are moving forward. You block the Clean Power Plan, utilities still move forward. You block the auto fuel efficiency standards, auto manufacturers still move forward. So we could either work on this bill, or communities you represent can be left behind. And sooner or later, they'll realize that it's your fault, that we should have worked together on this. Lastly, I want to mention that this would include solar, and it would include hydro, and it would include wind, and it would also include nuclear power. President Biden's climate plan includes nuclear power. Let me repeat that. President Biden's plan includes nuclear power. It calls for the development of small modular reactors. SMRs. So I offer to work with you all. Let me end just by talking to Mr. Persiasepi. We know we have in Florida the Martin Next Generation Solar Energy Center located in Indiantown, and concentrating solar power has been a real potential. Can you go into some of the roles that CSP can play in expanding the use of renewables in the industrial sector, Mr. Persiasepi?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes, concentrated solar power is different in a way than what we traditionally think with the photovoltaic cells. It is taking concentrating the forces of the sun into a more defined point or space, which can create very high temperatures. And so for some industrial operations that need high temperatures and have the space for that kind of a collection system, you can definitely achieve some exceedingly high temperatures, which is really one of the more challenging part of the industrial sector. But if you're looking at an industrial park or some other large industrial complex, usually it'll be harder to implement that. So it has a role. It's an important part of the solution, but it will have that geographically limited ability.
Thank you, Mr. Persiasepi. My time is expired and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the former vice chair of the Standing Committee on Energy and Commerce and a fellow New Yorker, Representative Clark. You're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McKinley, for convening today's hearing, a hearing on important set of provisions within the Clean Future Act. And thank you to our witnesses for your testimony. We've heard from our witnesses, it's crucial that we scale up investment in the clean technologies and infrastructure. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking with a minority-owned clean energy startup called We Solar CSP, which has an office in my district. Their unique solar thermal technology allows them to provide scalable clean energy for a variety of applications, including industrial. Now what they need is the financing and opportunity to put their technology into action. I think that the Clean Energy Sustainability Accelerator included in the Clean Future Act is a perfect example of how the federal government can help address this need. In my home state of New York, we've seen firsthand just how beneficial these types of programs can be. Since its inception, the New York Green Bank has used $1.2 billion of public funds to stimulate over $3.4 billion in total investment in clean energy and energy efficiency projects across New York State. But that's not all. I'm proud to say that New York City is home to the first local green bank in the United States, known as the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation. In my district in Brooklyn, this program helped finance an affordable multi-family solar and storage microgrid at the Marcus Garvey Apartments, serving 625 units. This investment has resulted in a clean and resilient energy system that also provides major savings on energy costs for community residents. Across the nation, state and local green banks have helped communities save money, improve efficiency, and reduce emissions. Now it's time we bring this model to the federal level. So, Mr. Persiasepi, do you agree that establishing a national accelerator will help reduce the cost of climate action and expedite the transition into a cleaner, healthier, and more prosperous economy? Mr. Persiasepi?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
We can now.
I'm sorry. I hope it's not my side over here, but I am on my personal internet here. The accelerator is broadly constructed to look at solutions and cooperating with the local green banks as well. So I think it has a great opportunity to help accelerate the work that's underway by existing green banks, but also fill in gaps where those existing green banks haven't yet gone in the more broader economic.
And why is it so important that we make financing for clean technology and clean infrastructure more accessible all the way down to the community level?
Well, one of the barriers, obviously, to transition and also to innovation is that next step. And whether it's transitioning at the community level or becoming more resilient at a community level, which is also part of the portfolio of the accelerator, all of these things require that insertion of investment. And so this is a real opportunity to bring together both the green and clean technology and accelerating that and providing financing for it to move toward being commercialized, and at the same time looking at the infrastructure and other needs at the local community level as part of that resiliency component.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The ability to focus investments on local circumstances is critical to addressing the needs of local communities, particularly environmental justice communities. I'm very glad to see that our committee's accelerator proposal places this issue front and center by directing 40% of investments to frontline and disadvantaged areas. I thank my colleague, the gentlelady from Michigan, Rep. Dingle, for her leadership on the accelerator, and I look forward to working with her and the committee to advance this program. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back, and now we go to, I believe, our last colleague to question, and that would be the gentleman from Virginia, Representative Griffin. Thank you for your patience, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for letting me wave on, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate it. It's a policy it's a bipartisan policy this committee's had for some time, and allows us to get into issues that we consider important, even if we're not on the subcommittee, if we are on the full committee. So I do appreciate it. Mr. Sunday, I have appreciated your perspective today and in your testimony on how we can leverage our historical leadership in energy and industry to continue leading the world in clean and affordable electricity. On page 9 of your testimony, you state that the cost of triggering NSR, New Source Review, has caused companies in your state to cancel projects that would have reduced emissions, lowered operating costs, and improved public health and our environment. I always like to describe this as forcing a company to swallow the apple whole. Whereas if we take bites, or if we allow the company to take bites out of that apple, they would be able to consume the apple. In other words, get the improvements that needed out there. But if they're forced because of NSR to take it all in at one time, then they just don't do it. Do you agree with that assessment or analysis?
Yes, I do. It's certainly an obstacle to enhancing the operations of domestic facilities and getting cleaner. It's a very perverse regulatory approach that discourages cleaner operations from our facilities.
And in fact, I will tell you that, and I've said this before in committee and other contexts, that whether they could get around it or not, I have a furniture manufacturing facility in my district that now has a conveyor belt to nowhere. It goes out, I don't know, 50, 75, 100 yards and comes back because at one time part of their paint process was at the other end of the conveyor belt, but they've been advised by their attorneys because of NSR not to take that conveyor belt out, because then that would trigger the entire set of the Clean Air Act rules coming down on their heads. And they're like, okay, it costs us a couple of seconds in manufacturing of each piece of furniture that we do, case goods. But even though we're fighting every second to get it better to compete with the Chinese, we can't afford to suddenly have all these new rules placed on us at one time. Do you have similar stories, or have you heard stories like that as well?
Yeah, it comes up in a number of contexts. Maybe you come out of an economic recession and your factory wants to run more. NSR is going to hit you if your emissions, if you're going to make a significant modification. In other circumstances, maybe you want to add another shift, and NSR again comes into play. As you mentioned, it discourages efficiency improvements. And as you know, we've had the opportunity at the chamber to come down in front of this committee in the past and talk about your potential solutions, other ways to make NSR better. whatever we want to make in this country, whether it's solar panels, telecommunications assets, et cetera, NSR reform has got to be on the table if we're going to talk about competitiveness.
And I appreciate that. And people need to remember that, that NSR is just one piece of the complicated Clean Air Act regulatory puzzle. And providing much needed clarity to this complex program does not take away from other provisions under the Clean Air Act. And it's clear that providing greater certainty through common sense targeted reforms will replace some of the ambiguity and confusion surrounding NSR and result in a more effective and efficient program. And you mentioned that I have legislation, and I do, the NSR Improvement Act, and it would do that. But there's nothing in the Clean Future Act or the Climate Leadership and Environmental Action for Our Nation's Future Act. There's nothing in there that deals with NSR reform, is there?
No, sir.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Would adopting an hourly emissions rate test like the one used in the EPA's New Source Performance Standard program enhance the New Source Review or NSR program so that companies can update their facilities and install technologies like carbon capture? Would that be helpful?
Yes, and that's a solution we've endorsed in the past.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And in fact, as you may recall, the language that was in the underlying bills that started the NSR and started the New Source Performance Standard, that language is virtually identical, but because of interpretations in different divisions of the EPA, we have completely different applications. Is that not your understanding as well?
Yeah, it really depends on the regional office. Yeah.
Yeah. And that makes it hard for businesses to make decisions, does it not?
Yeah, or at least causes certain parts of the country to lose out on investment.
And that investment would make the air cleaner, correct?
Correct. Again, we can't just put blinders on and pretend that it's only what's going on in the United States. It's a globally competitive market.
I'm for getting the air cleaner. Let's pass some NSR reform. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I believe that completes the list of colleagues who had chosen to ask questions. I again thank our witnesses for joining us at today's hearing. Their input is extremely appreciated. I do remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witnesses. I ask that each witness please respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. Before we adjourn, I know that a number of documents have been asked to be entered into the record by our colleagues. So I hereby ask unanimous consent for the following documents to be entered into the record. A letter from Forterra, a report from analysis group entitled Accelerating Job Growth and an Equitable Low Carbon Energy Transition, the Role of the Clean Energy Accelerator. A report from Brattle entitled Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, Opportunities for Long-Term Deployment. A statement from the American Forest and Paper Association. A statement from the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance. A report from Coalition for Green Capital entitled Accelerating Investment in Clean Energy and Climate Infrastructure to Create Jobs and Drive an Equitable and Just Transition. Policy Analysis of the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator. A letter from the Industrial Energy Consumers of America. A report from Climate Works entitled Build Clean, Industrial Policy for Climate and Justice. A report from the Just Transition Fund entitled National Economic Transition Platform. A report from the State of Colorado's Department of Labor and Employment entitled Colorado Just Transition Action Plan. A report from the State of Colorado's Department of Labor and Employment entitled The Need for Federal Support to Ensure Just Transitions for Local Energy Economies. A letter from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. A letter from the Portland Cement Association. A report from the Lawrence Livermore National Library entitled Permitting Carbon Capture and Storage Projects in California. Without objection, so ordered. So with all of that, we again encourage our witnesses to respond promptly to any questions that are submitted after this given formal part of the hearing. And at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you very much.